Sometimes when you're developing a Django app, you might want to track how many times a user is visiting your site and which pages they are visiting on your website. You might want to track the number of logins, and you also might want to track a history of all of the changes that are made to particular models in your application. We're going to look at an app in this video called django-easy-audit. And this app allows you to store that information in your database, and then you can use that information for analysis about how users are using your website and what pages they are visiting and so on. Let's dive in and see how to use this package in this video. Now, I've got the GitHub open for this package. It's called django-easy-audit, and as it says on the right hand side, this is yet another Django audit log app, and hopefully the simplest one. Now, this is one of many. Here's another popular one here. It's called Django Audit Log. We're going to look specifically at this one because it has quite a lot of stars, it's well rated, and it's also the one that I've used before very recently in a professional project. Now, you might want to use an app like this so you can track how users are using your website, and you can then take that data and use it to try and increase the engagement of these users on your website. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to this documentation. I'm going to copy this pip install command, and I'll leave a link to the GitHub page here in the video description. Once we've copied that, what we're going to do is open up VS Code. Now, I have a very simple Django application in VS Code here. As you can see, we have a single view called index, and at the moment we don't have any models in this application, so very basic application in Django. What we're going to do is, if you've activated a virtual environment, we're going to install the django-easy-audit package here, and that's going to allow us to use that in this Django application. Now, once that's installed, what we're going to do is open up settings.py, and we're going to add this package to the installed apps. Now, in order to do that, we can go back to GitHub, and what we're going to add is Easy Audit. So we can add that at the bottom, right below the core application, Easy Audit. Now, there's only a couple of extra steps here in order to get this up and running. What we're going to do is copy the name of the middleware class, and we need to add that to the middleware list. So let's copy the name of that, and the middleware list is just below installed apps. I'm just going to add that just after the session middleware. So let's add that and save the settings.py file. What we need to do now is run the migrate command. You can see that is here in the documentation, python manage.py migrate, and then the name of the app, in this case it's Easy Audit. We're just going to run the migrate command globally. We're not going to specify an individual app, so it's going to be python manage.py and migrate. That's going to generate a SQLite database in this application, and it's going to have all of the models that we have, which is currently no models, and it's also going to add all the models from Django's auth package and also from any installed extensions, and we have Easy Audit here. So let's have a quick look at that database, because Easy Audit does come with some tables and therefore Django models built in. We're going to use these a little bit later in the video, but we've got here a database.sqlite free file, and I'm going to open that database, and I'm using a SQLite extension for VS Code in order to do that. And we can look in this table here and we can see the different, we can look in the database and we can see the different tables that we have. And you can see at the bottom we've got 3 different tables for Easy Audit. There's one called CRUD event, one called login event, and another called request event. So this app, django-easy-audit, it comes with 3 tables, and these are for tracking events in your application. Now, request event does, as you would imagine, it tracks all of the requests that are being sent, and it tracks data such as the pages and the type of request, whether it's a GET or a POST request, and so on. And we'll see the specific columns later in the video. We also have a login event table, and that's going to track all logins to the application, and that can be useful for measuring the engagement of users. How often are they logging in? How many users are logging in each week, each month, and so on. And finally, we have a CRUD event table, and that's going to track all of the changes that are made to your Django models in this particular application, whether it's a create or an update or a delete. It's going to track all of that, and it's going to tell you the history of how the state changed from the start to the end for that particular model. So that's the tables that we have here. And what I'm going to do is clear the terminal, and I'm going to run the create super user command, and let's create a super user called admin in this application, and we're going to use that super user to log into Django's admin. So once we have the super user, I'm going to run the Django development server, and we're going to go to the browser, and I'm going to go to the admin UI. So we have the admin page here, and I'm going to log in with this user, and you can see the three models on the left hand side here for the 𝗦cie_audit application. And if I click the login events table here, you can see we already have one event, and that's because I've just logged in to the admin UI using this admin user. So if we click through to that, we can see all the details associated with that login. We have the user who logged in, so we get the username here and also the instance of the user. So that's kind of like a foreign key to the user model in your application. So we know exactly who logged in. We have an event type, which is login, and we also have details such as the remote IP address, which in this case is just localhost, and the time when this login occurred. And it's the timestamp that we have in this table that will allow us to do that analytics if we need to do any kind of metrics on how many users are logging into the application. And we can see this as well in our database table. If we right click this login event table and show the table here, we now have the record in the table that tracks this login, including the username and the user ID, which is the foreign key to that user table. So we have an event or a record now in the login table, and you can imagine that you have an app that's deployed online and you have hundreds of logins an hour or a day. That table is going to track all of them. It's going to track when it occurred, and you can then do your analytics based on that data. So that's the login event table. We also have a request event, and we're going to see how that works now. If I go to the admin UI, if we go to the actual application, this is on localhost 8000. Now I have a single URL that maps to that single view, and that's just on the root URL, localhost 8000. I can refresh that, and what's going to happen is it's going to store each of the requests in that other table called request events. So let's click through to that, and you can see we have these two requests to that root URL, and we have the timestamps again for each of these requests. And these events, again, they can be tracked by timestamp or they can be aggregated by timestamp. And you can also dive into the users themselves, so you can see for each user what particular pages are they visiting, how often are they visiting your website, and which pages are they going to. And this can be very useful for analytics and for trying to increase that engagement by identifying which areas of your website are popular and which other areas are not so popular and could maybe do with some work. So that's the two most simple tables that we have out of these three tables. We have the login and the request event tables. We're now going to look at this 𝗦cie_audit CRUD event table. So any changes that happen to models in our application can be tracked through this table. And we can show this with the user model to start with. What I'm going to do is go back to the Django admin, and I'm going to go to this users table here. We have one user, that's the super user that we created called admin. What I'm going to do is add a first name and a last name here for this user. So we've added David Brent to this application. What I'm going to do is go down and save this record, and we're going to go back to the home page, and I'm going to go to the CRUD events table here. Now we have three records at the moment in this table. Firstly, we have a create record, and that is when we actually created the super user themselves through the command line. So that created the user and it stored that create event in the CRUD events table. And the other two are update methods, and we can actually go in and see what has changed between the previous state and the new state. There's a column in this table called changed fields here, and that stores a dictionary basically, and the keys are the actual field that's changed on the model, and the value is a list containing in its first element the previous state, which in this case was none, and in its second element is the new state for that field. So in this case what's happened is that the user's last login field has changed from null to the timestamp when that user logged in, and that happened when I logged into the Django admin. It stored that update and it tracked the difference between the previous state and the new state. And if we look at the second update and go to the changed fields here, you can see that not only is the last login changing, but also the first name and the last name has changed as well. So this CRUD events model, this allows you to track how your models, how your data is changing, who is responsible for that change, and that can allow you to build up an audit log of what's going on in your application. And that can be important if you are being audited, for example, and you need to track historical data and track who is changing and accessing that data. So this can be very useful, and it can also, of course, inform your analytics. So we've seen that with the user model. What I'm going to do in this video is go to the application here, and I'm going to go to the models.py file. And I'm going to create a model here, and I'm just going to copy paste this into the file. And it's a model called instrument, and that consists of three fields. We have the name, the status, and a foreign key to the user. And this model is going to track instruments that we have. Let's say we're in a laboratory or some other environment like that, and each instrument has a name and it has a particular status that is defined by this choice field here. So we have a subclass of Django's integer choices class, and there are 3 statuses: available, on hire, and damaged. And what's going to happen here is each instrument will have one of those statuses. And we have a user field, and that's a foreign key, but it may be null. Now it's null if the instrument isn't out at a given time, but the idea is if the instrument is on hire, we want this user to be populated with the actual user who has got that instrument. So it's going to track who has the instrument at a given time. So what I'm going to do is stop the Django server, and we're going to run the make migrations command. That creates a migration for this instrument model, and then we can run the migrate command to effect that change to the database. And any changes now that we make to this instrument model are going to be logged in the CRUD events table. So let's start the Django server, and I'm going to go back to the admin UI at the moment. So let's go back to the home page here, and we need to register this model with the admin UI in order to create one of them. So let's copy the name of the model, and we're going to go to admin.py, and I'm going to import that model at the top from core.model. So let's import the instrument model, and then we can call admin.site.register and pass that model in as an argument. Once that's done, we can go to the Django admin. Let's refresh the page, and we now have this model here, and we can actually go to this and add a new instrument. So let's say we have, I don't know, a telescope, and the status is on hire, and it's been hired by this admin user guy. Let's click save here, and that's going to create that instrument in the database when we hit save. And if we go back to the home page and go to the CRUD events, we can now see that we have a create method on the instrument model here. Now notice the format of this. We have a content type, which is either the instrument or the user at the moment, and that content type is basically referring to Django's content types framework. It's referring to a model that's installed in this Django application. And as well as the model, we also have the object ID here for that particular model. So for the instrument model, we know that this create event was for that instrument that has ID 1. And this is using Django's content types framework, and it's adding a generic foreign key to the CRUD events table. And this allows us to add the foreign key from the CRUD event flexibly to any other model in the Django app by using the content types framework to get the related model, and then the object ID will give us the actual instance of that model. So that's just a bit of extra knowledge on how this is working and how it works with any model. And I'm going to do a video on the content types framework as part of the ORM series that I'm doing very soon. But for now, let's move on. And what I'm going to do with this instrument model is I'm going to create a Django management command that's going to populate the database, or rather populate this CRUD events table with a lot of different events, so we can see how we might aggregate those events in a real application. And by doing this, we're also going to see how we can use the built-in models that django-easy-audit provides in order to help us generate some analysis of these database tables. So what I'm going to do is go to VS Code, and I have a folder in this starter code called management/commands, and that contains 2 commands. We have a simulator and another command called aggregate. And what we're going to do in this simulator command is we're going to simulate many changes to the instrument model. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is just paste in the code for the handle method, and we're going to go over this code now in this video. So what we have is a handle method. What we're doing is we are deleting any users that are not the admin user, just so we avoid the duplication of users below here when we create 8 users. So we have a for loop for I in range 8, and then we are calling user.objects.createUser, and we're passing in a username, which is just user 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And every user in this app has a password of test. Not recommended in real life, but it will do for the management command. Once we've added those users, we're fetching them from the database here on line 16 using the user.objects.all function. And this is going to give us 8 users to work with in this application. Below that, we then create some instruments, and again we're creating 8 of these, and we're calling the instrument.objects.get or create method, and we're giving each instrument a name, and we're giving all instruments the status of available when they're first input into the database. And again, after that for loop has run, we are pulling all of those into the application from the database, calling instrument.objects.all, And the final for loop here is what's actually going to make the updates or the changes to those instruments. So we're looping 100 times, and for each iteration we are getting a random instrument from this list above, and we are allocating a random user to the user field and a random status from that Django choice field. Once we've done that, we call instrument.save, and that's going to put that change into the CRUD events table. So let's see that in action. If we stop the Django server, what I'm going to do is run python manage.py, and the name is simulator. So let's run this command and see what happens. And I've got a not implemented error. Subclasses of base command must provide a handle method. I think that might have been some indentation from when I copied that, so let's try this again, and we are now seeing that this is running. It's going to take a little bit of time, not long, but a little bit of time to run through that, and then it's going to save all of those CRUD events for each update to the database. So let's go back to the Django admin UI, and this is the CRUD events table. At the moment you can see there are 4 events. When we refresh this page, you can now see we have many of these events, 120 in total. And you can see that we also have some useful filters that we can do. So for example, at the top here, we can filter down only to the events on a particular date. And this is useful for admins that might be going in to see what has changed and when things have changed in the application. And on the right hand side, we also have some filters that we can apply. And we can filter, for example, by event type. So if you wanted to see all of the delete events that had occurred and who had performed those deletes, you could filter down here to just those, and you can also filter down by content type, so that can give you only the changes that have occurred to a particular model in the application, and also by user. So this library, django-easy-audit, comes with some useful utilities on the Django admin. What we're going to do now is go back to this VS Code here, and we're going to go to aggregate.py and write a script to aggregate the CRUD events that are in the application. And this will simulate what you might want to do if you wanted to get an audit log of all the historical changes to a particular model in the application. So at the top we've got some imports. We're importing the instrument model, we're importing the content type model from Django's content types framework, and we're also importing from 𝗙𝗂𝗿.models the CRUD event model. So each of these database tables added by this library has an associated model that you can import and then perform normal database operations with that model. So we're going to do that now in this management command. So what we want to do is get all of the CRUD events for a particular instrument in our database. So let's start by pulling that instrument out. So it's going to be stored in a variable called instrument, and it's going to be instrument.objects, and let's just call the .first method to get the very first object from the database table. What we need to do in order to get the CRUD events, if we go back to the Django admin, is we need the content type, which is for the instrument model. So what we're going to do is use a utility function, and we're going to store the result in a variable called content type, and we're going to use that content type model that we imported at the top here. That has a function .objects.getForModel. So the .getForModel function, that will take in a model instance in Django, and we already have that model above. It's the instrument model, and what that's going to do is it's going to return the record from the content types table in order for us to use when we're filtering down these CRUD events. And just for reference, if we go back to the database at the bottom here, if we go to the content types table, the Django content type table here, what we're going to get is an app label and a model. So for example, in our core application we have the instrument model, and that has a content type ID of 7 in this application. So we're going to refer to this content type within our code in this script. So we have the content type now. What we can do is create another variable which I'll call CRUD events, and we're going to use the object that we've imported from django-easy-audit. That's the CRUD event object, and that's a model, therefore it has the .objects.filter function, and we can pass the filter arguments in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to get all of the CRUD events where the content type is equal to this content type that we pulled out on line 11, and then we're also going to pass in an object ID. So we're telling the CRUD event table that we want the instrument content type, but we don't want them for all instruments. We want to filter down further by an object ID, and that's going to be the instrument that we pulled out's primary key. So this instrument here on line 10, it has a primary key. We want to get the CRUD events associated with that particular instrument. We are also passing an object ID into the filter function. And then once we get that result, I'm also going to chain a .order_by onto that, and we're going to order by the datetime field that's on that CRUD event model. And that's going to give us all of the events for this object, and it's going to give them from the earliest to the latest, and that allows us to build that historical log of all of the changes that have happened to that instrument. Once we've done that, we can then loop over these CRUD events. So for event in CRUD events, what we're going to do is we're just going to print something to the terminal for now, and we're going to print out that changed fields column that we saw in the database. So the event, or the instance of the CRUD event, has that field called changed fields. We're going to print that to the terminal, and let's now run this aggregation script. We need to stop the Django server, and what we're going to run is python manage.py and then the name of the command, which is aggregate. Now before I run this, I'm going to make the terminal bigger, and let's now run this and see what kind of changes have happened to that instrument. Now you can see at the beginning we have none, nothing changed in the first event, and that's because, well, I think that's because the instrument was created for the first time, so it wasn't a change, it was actually a create event. But then after that we have some changes occurring here. So for example, the status of that particular instrument went from 2 to 1, and if we look at the models.py file, that means that the instrument went from on hire to the status available. So that was the change there, and it also changed from user admin to user 1. And these fields don't necessarily make sense. If an instrument is available, it doesn't mean that the user should change as well, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And you can see these different changes happening, and sometimes only the user was changed from user 5 to user 7 here at the bottom. And these changes were coming from our simulator, which was taking a loop with 100 iterations, and it was assigning a random user and a random status to that instrument. Now you can imagine taking this kind of data further and building charts and building graphs in order to build dashboards and provide further analysis of this data. We're not going to do that. This is just a quick video on django-easy-audit, but there's lots of possibilities here, and you can imagine what you can do here in a real application that's collecting a lot of data. Now let's finish this video by looking at some settings that the module provides, and also talking about some caveats to this approach that we have here. So let's go to the settings page. I'll leave a link to this GitHub in the description of the video, and you can see some of the settings that we have here. For example, django-easy-audit watch model events, watch auth events, and watch request events. So what these do is you can actually turn some of these off. By default they're all on, but for example, if you wanted to stop logging your login attempts, you could set this auth events to false, and what that means is it's no longer going to log the logins to this login event table that we can see here. So if we look at that table, we have a single login event at the moment, as you can see, but if you set one of these settings, this one here, to false in the Django settings.py file, it's not going to log that data into that table anymore. And similarly for the model events, that's going to stop logging the CRUD events, and the request events, as you can imagine, that's going to stop logging into the request event table as well. Now why would you want to do this? Well, this can affect performance if you have too many writes going on to your database. So let's imagine you have a big application with lots of users who are doing lots of different things in that application. For things like requests, that's going to involve a write to the database every time the user does anything in the application. And writes can be expensive. It can take a bit of time to do that, especially if you have lots of users in the application. This can actually degrade the performance of a Django app, and it can also affect the scalability of the application. Another consideration is that your database might fill up very quickly if you have all of these turned on for every single model, for example. So we have the CRUD events table, and we had a simple script here, and now we have 120 records in that table. But you can imagine if users are frequently changing data in your application and you have lots of users, a table like this is going to fill up very quickly, and that might affect your database. You might need to increase the storage capacity of that database. And similarly, you might want to investigate some strategies like exporting this data periodically, for example, to something like Amazon S3, or maybe Azure Blob Storage or Dropbox or something like that. Ultimately, this data is there to provide a historical log of the changes that happened in a model, in the case of the CRUD event table. But in order to save money, you don't want to just keep that table filling up in the database. You might want to export that to some cheaper storage service like S3. And remember, files that are on S3 can still be analysed, they can be downloaded, they can be imported into Python applications. So you can still use that data, but storing it in your primary database might not be a good idea, or rather storing all of it without ever exporting that data away from the primary database. That can be a bad idea. So these are some caveats, and the settings can help with that by allowing you to turn off specific events. And below that we have another setting here called django-easy-audit unregistered classes extra. And this is a list of Django models that will be ignored by django-easy-audit. So if there are particular models in the application that you're not interested in building that historical log, you can switch off the logging for those models using this setting here. And that's for models. Below that we have another one for URLs. So you can add URLs in your application that you don't want to log requests for, and so on. So by taking advantage of these settings, you don't need to be logging to the database on every single request and on every single change that happens to any model in the application. So that covers some of the caveats and some of the settings you might want to use in this django-easy-audit package when you're actually making these logs and tracking this data in your database. I want to finish with a final thing that I want to show very quickly. If we go back to the Django admin, we have seen that this CRUD event table has grown quite large, and we discussed the caveats of that before when we can export some of that data away from the database, for example. But you might want to just get rid of this data as well. You might not want to export it to S3, you might want to just delete this data after a period of time if, for example, there's no interesting events that have happened in your application and you want to just start from scratch. Now, as we said earlier, there's some useful utilities added by django-easy-audit to the Django admin UI, and we saw some of these on the right hand side with the filters that you can see here, but there's actually another button on top of that, just above that rather, and that button has the text purge CRUD events, and we can click that button in order to get rid of all of these CRUD events from the database table. And as it says here, this operation is destructive, it cannot be undone, and it may require some minutes. So if you hit yes, I'm sure, what's going to happen is it's going to clear out that table, and as you can see, we're left with 0 CRUD events in this database table now. So if you need to clear out some space in your database, you can actually just purge all of these via the Django admin as well. So that's all for this video. We've covered the django-easy-audit package that you can use in order to build these audit logs of what's happening in your Django application. If you're interested in more of these types of videos, for example another package like Django audit log, or you have any particular ideas about what we could build with this type of tracking, please let me know in the comments and we'll consider building that. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying this content, please consider also buying the channel a coffee. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.